The ocean sounded like a promise it didn't intend to keep, rolling in lace-edged and indifferent, hissing secrets against the pilings of the rented beach house deck where she lounged like a sunlit lie. Kate's sunglasses were a slick mirror, throwing my reflection back at me as something flatter than a man, an outline in her content calendar, a placeholder in her reels, a body that carried bags and paid deposits and conveniently didn't clash with her aesthetic. When she said it, she didn't sit up or soften, she tipped her head just enough to let the words slide past a smile. "Don't act like we're serious, this is just fun for me." The sentence landed between us like a glass ornament shattering in sand, no clean lines, only glittering pain pretending to be pretty. The house itself was a catalog page come alive. White shiplap walls, salt-bleached driftwood table, a bowl of limes so green they felt fictional. Ceiling fans clicked a lazy metronome above the wide, open room where my duffel sat obediently by the door, zipped tight like a throat holding back the wrong truth. Outside, gulls drew punctuation marks in the sky as if they were annotating our conversation for posterity. Inside, I tried to remember how to breathe like someone whose lungs weren't on camera. I had rented this place for a long weekend, my careful splurge, my quiet declaration that what we were building deserved a view. I'd imagined slow mornings with coffee, afternoon naps woven through with laughter, evenings where the horizon did that blue-orange miracle and we let words fall lightly into the dark. Instead, she sprawled in a gauzy cover-up and treated the room like a studio, pausing only to point her phone toward herself, toward the sun, toward the curl of her knee as if it were a coastline worth naming. "What do you mean, just fun?" The question felt thin, like a bedsheet held against a storm. But it was all I had, the stubborn impulse to force a definition into a space that had benefited from remaining vague. She sighed, the way people sigh when asked to repeat a boundary they hope will be obeyed if etched deep enough. "We're having a good time, right? You're sweet. This," she waved a hand that smelled like coconut sunscreen and cool detachment, "is great. But you're reading chapters that I never wrote." Something small and faithful broke inside my chest with a quiet "I will hear until I die." I thought about the transmission I'd paid to replace when her car died on a weekday morning she called a crisis, and I called an opportunity to show up. I thought about the tickets I'd bought to movies she skipped for rooftop sunsets and brand collabs with strangers whose names sounded like stores. I thought about the coffee shop table where my text bubbles went from blue to blue to blue without an answer while her stories bloomed gold hour after gold hour, a parade of curated joy in which I was a shadow that didn't photograph well. "This isn't a sponsored post," I said, and the edge in my tone surprised me. "It's my life." She pulled her sunglasses down her nose so I could see the exact shade of her eyes, the green of a place that promises depth but remains shallow on purpose. "Don't make it a thing," she said. "We're good as long as it stays light." Light, the word had done so much work in our orbit. Light meals, light edits, light commitments, light touch. Light as in air, light as in weightless, light as in easy to drop. I looked past her at the long line of the shore. Families erected little fortresses of umbrellas. Kids shrieked at cold water like it was the world's first surprise. A man ran with a dog whose joy was so pure I wanted to borrow it for an hour. "What happens when the tide goes out?" I asked. She frowned like I'd changed the subject. "What happens when there's nothing left to float?" She shrugged. "Then we go somewhere else." In the kitchen, the bowl of limes waited to be sliced and the knife on the cutting board threw a little sun. I thought about the spreadsheet that had gotten me here, savings and columns, and the way discipline can build a moment worth living in. I thought about the way her attention spiked when a view could be framed and sank when a night required staying put. I thought about the last 3 months, the way her warmth flowed toward the scenic and receded from the ordinary, like affection itself had been trained by an algorithm. "I rented this for us," I said softly, a last small offering held out to a god that had never promised to answer. She smiled then, sweet and almost kind, the way a person smiles at a waiter they're about to undertip. "And that was generous, seriously, you're generous." She leaned back, reached for the phone again, angled it just so. "Let's not complicate it." Complicate, as if love were a knot one could keep from forming by refusing to look at the rope. As if commitment were a glitch to be patched out in the next update. As if I were a nice amenity like high thread count sheets or a carbonated water tap, whose job was to make the experience smoother without ever being the point. Something in me stood up while I was still sitting. The part of me that reads the fine print and pays debts early and believes in calling a thing what it is rose up with quiet dignity and put on its shoes. "Okay," I said, surprising both of us, "then have fun." I stood, the floor was cool under my feet and unbelievably clean, like no one had ever bled here. I zipped my bag. I texted the property manager a courteous note that there would be one guest instead of two, that she could keep the key until checkout, that any additional fees could be charged to my card on file. Then I walked to the sliding glass door and opened it. Warm wind, sea salt, a brightness so honest it hurt. Wait, she said, phone forgotten now, a flicker of real alarm clouding the placid surface. What are you doing? Leaving you to your fun, I said, and the words were not anger but a benediction I didn't mean to give. You wanted light, light is what doesn't stay. I took the stairs two at a time, my bag thumping rhythmic against my thigh, my breath doing strange things like it had to relearn its shape. In the driveway, the sun had warmed the hood of my car into a small, private Mercy. I slid in, turned the key, and felt the engine catch like a decision. On the highway, the ocean kept pace, glittering like a promise made to someone else. My phone buzzed and then stilled, and the silence did not accuse me. In its absence, a different soundtrack emerged, the steady thrum of tires, the occasional rush of wind through a cracked window, the faint rattle of ice in the to-go cup I'd forgotten in the console. Between mile markers, grief and relief braided into a rope strong enough to hold for now. Back in San Diego, the sky went orange as if it had forgiven everyone for everything. I parked outside my apartment and sat for a minute with my hands on the wheel, soft with salt and sunscreen and the residue of a goodbye that had never learned the courtesy of ceremony. Then I went upstairs, set my bag down, and stood in the threshold of my own life like a man just released from a beautiful jail. By nightfall, the beach house had turned into a stage, and I had become the villain in a story that didn't need me to be true, until the screenshots started moving faster than her tears. The social media storm built with a professional's precision. A soft launch grievance at noon, a tear-sheened selfie by 2, a carousel of cryptic quotes by 4, an after-dark confession about betrayal that landed like a bomb designed to scatter empathy in a 10-mile radius. The captions read like lyric essays about fake people who vanish when it matters, long threads of vague accusation that tagged no one while pointing at me with the accuracy of a laser sight. It was almost impressive, the choreography, the cadence, the way she understood where to stand in the algorithm's current so it would carry her furthest. Almost, I watched without watching, muted the sound. Let the images flip past like a deck of cards dealing itself. I had spent months learning to read the fine print in her eyes, the clause that said engagement comes first, intimacy negotiated later, if at all. What I hadn't anticipated, what felt like a quiet miracle in a city where gossip travels faster than fog, was how quickly the counter-narrative would assemble itself from receipts and witnesses and people done being props. Screenshots have a way of being both blunt and surgical. The thread of texts where plans dissolved because Sunset Vibes SD had an opening she couldn't miss. The Venmo trail of "I'll pay you back next week" notes that turned into calendar ghosts. The DM to a mutual friend calling our relationship practice, a rehearsal for a final act in which I would not be cast, each image a small square of truth, alone regrettable. Together, a mosaic that suggested a system rather than a series of accidents. Emma had been there at the house that weekend, floating between kindness and exasperation, and she texted me that afternoon like a lifeguard blowing a whistle. "She's telling Ohio you stranded her with no way home," Emma wrote. "People are asking." I sent the screenshots I'd kept not as weapons but as a record to keep me from gaslighting myself. Emma sent them to the friends who had been taught to see Kate as the protagonist in every room. And then something rare happened. The narrative buckled under the weight of context. Comments began to appear under her posts, not from trolls but from longtime followers with patience for humanity and less for performance. "This feels really performative," one wrote. "Why are you making this public?" "Handle it privately," said another. The tone shifted from sympathy to skepticism, then to exhaustion, an audience tired of being conscripted into a stranger's personal theater where every plot twist was an opportunity code for monetization. By evening, brands whose emails used to move her like tides began to step back, politely but unmistakably. Collabs paused, friendly emojis cooled. A glossy wellness company posted a bland statement about aligning with creators who reflect our values. Her follower count dipped with the sickening smoothness of a roller coaster drop. The thing she had built out of sunsets and codes and the careful curation of desire started losing its anchors in real time, and there was a terrible justice in it that I took no joy in and could still not look away from. I had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt old. A tiredness came over me like a tide I didn't remember inviting. The cost of being reduced to content, the humiliation of having to prove harm in public, the absurdity of fighting for dignity in a space designed to sand it down for better engagement. I closed the apps, I made pasta. I ate at my small table and listened to the fan hum a song about ordinary air. Late, Mike called. "You good?" he asked, the way friends ask when they know the answer is complicated. I told him I was okay in the way that means not yet but someday. He told me he'd talked to people, that the truth was walking on its own now, that I didn't need to chase it to its destination. Let it do the work, he said. You go sleep. Sleep came like a guest who insists on tidying before leaving. In the morning, I woke to quiet, fewer buzzes, a steadier heart. I ran by the bay, the air cool and salt clean, and let my legs remember that my body is a place that does not require approval to be worth inhabiting. On the way back, a pelican dive-bombed and came up with a fish that flashed silver in its pouch like a quick apology from the universe for yesterday's mess. At lunch, I saw Emma at a cafe where the coffee was decent and the chairs were forgiving. She hugged me like she was returning something. You did the right thing, she said. Boundaries aren't abandonment. Besides, you didn't leave a person, you left a performance. The sentence settled in me like a keystone. She'll be okay. Or she won't. That's not your homework anymore. That night, alone with my small lamp lit and the sound of neighbors living lives on the other side of drywall, I took out a notebook and made 2 lists. On one side, what I wanted to be true about love. On the other, what I would no longer entertain. The first list was short and weighty: mutuality, kindness, slowness that isn't laziness but attention, equilibrium not dependent on an audience. The second was longer and felt lighter with each line, being used as scaffolding, being edited into a role I didn't audition for, being benched when the lighting wasn't right. I closed the notebook and felt a small click inside, like the sound a cabinet makes when it finally closes flush. A week later, at a marine conservation fundraiser my company sponsored, I met Bate. She laughed the first time I told the story of the beach house, not at me but at the absurd theater of it all. Wait, she said, grinning in a way that made the room feel like fresh air. 6 months as a pair of anonymous hands. That's not romance, that's witness protection with craft services. I barked a laugh so loud people turned. It felt like a muscle I hadn't used in months, surprised to learn it still worked. Bate talked about coral with reverence and practicality, about bleaching and restoration, and the way damaged ecosystems can return if given both time and unglamorous care. She didn't have Instagram. She had a waterproof camera and a calendar that smelled like salt. When we exchanged numbers, she said, "If you ever want to see a nursery of baby corals, I can show you. They're not cute in a way that plays online. They're cute in the way that makes you want to be a better person." The part of me that had just made a list about attention and slowness recognized an answer walking into the room. The ocean that had once applauded my humiliation became a classroom until a familiar tide, dressed in contrition, tried to drag me back out. Bates' world existed below the surface, which felt appropriate for a life that had been flattened into likes. On the first dive she invited me on, the water took me in with a cool, insistent embrace, the kind that demands presence in exchange for wonder. We kicked slow over a garden in repair, fragile scaffolds where coral nubbins clung like hope with tiny mouths, cleaner fish doing their devout work, a turtle passing like an old priest deciding we were acceptable. Bates signaled with a pinch of fingers, "Look." I looked until my eyes remembered how. After, on the dock, we ate sandwiches with too much mustard and let the sun turn the salt on our skin into maps. She talked about patience like it was a tool you keep sharpened. People love transformation stories, she said. They don't love the waiting and the tedious care, but that's where the miracle is: boredom with purpose. I nodded and thought of spreadsheets, of saving for a beach house, of the unsexy fidelity of showing up. I thought of how love had become an algorithm and how here, at last, was a system with different laws: gravity, metabolism, the honest arithmetic of what lives and what doesn't. We moved slowly, on purpose. Coffee that didn't have to become content. Walks that ended where they started. Dinners cooked badly, then better. Once, at the farmer's market, she held up a bruised peach and gave me a look. "Still sweet," she said, and bit into it. Juice ran down her wrist in a line I wanted to memorize in every season. Then the text, a number I didn't have saved, a tone I could have identified in a blind lineup. "Hey, can we talk? I'm outside." I looked out my window and there she was in the fading gold, hair damp with the ocean she used to demand we court, a tote bag over her shoulder like she'd brought props. I thought about not answering the door. I thought about the dignity of silence. I opened it anyway because some parts of closure require an audience of two. "Hi," Kate said, and the word came with a practiced tremor. "You look good." "So do you," I said, because old habits die as politely as they can. She stepped into my living room and looked around with undisguised curiosity, like a producer scouting a location. "Nice place," she said. "Are those corals?" She nodded at the photos Bate had given me, prints of restoration sites where color had returned like forgiveness. "Friends' work," I said. She took a breath the way people do when about to attempt a stunt. "I wanted to apologize," she said. "I made a mess. I made you into content when you were a person. I said things that weren't fair. I'm paying for it." The last sentence came with a haunted laugh that wasn't funny. Brands pulled out. "People left, Dylan left," I thought. She stopped, tried again. "I hurt you, I'm sorry." I believed her in the way one believes a forecast that promises rain on a sky that still looks blue. The apology had weight. Whether it had duration remained to be seen. "Thank you," I said, and meant it, even as something protective inside me kept its coat on. "I've been thinking," she said, stepping closer as if closeness could negotiate terms. "We were good together when we didn't make it heavy. Maybe we could try that again." She smiled the old smile, bright and practiced and built to sell. "No labels, just, fun." The line returned like a tide that believes in itself. I felt the pull in my calves, the old erosion starting at my ankles. Fun had been the trap disguised as a trampoline. Fun had been the tax on feeling. Fun had been a gilded synonym for disposable. Behind her, the coral prints glowed with evening light, small proofs that rehabilitation's opposite is relapse. "I don't do just fun anymore," I said. "Not with people. Not with myself." Her face flickered, hurt, frustration, calculation, all the expressions that had once read to me as depth. "So this is it, you're with someone." "I'm with a life," I said. "And there's someone in it who doesn't need a witness to be real." She looked at the prints again, then at me, and something softer moved through her expression, some recognition that the camera couldn't earn. "I really am sorry," she said, "for the house. For the stories, for making you prove every day that you were enough for a story I hadn't decided to tell." "Apology accepted," I said. It felt like setting a small boat into water and watching it ride cleanly over a wave that would have flipped it last year. She left with her tote of props and a dignity I wanted to root for. When the door clicked behind her, the apartment exhaled. I texted Bate, "Rough surf, calm now." She replied with a photo of a baby coral sprig under a UV lamp stubbornly glowing. "They're tougher than they look," she wrote. "You too." The ocean gives back what it takes in its own time. On the day a riptide grabbed us, I learned what I wanted to be when the water decided it didn't care. The riptide didn't announce itself. It just altered the math. One minute the water lapped our knees like a dog that trusted us, the next it sucked like a promise breaking in reverse. We were chest high when the pull came, a horizontal gravity that laughed at legs and insisted on panic. Bates' eyes widened, and even in the churn I saw the calculation, a scientist clocking variables and choosing a protocol. "Don't fight it," she said, calm, slicing the foam. "Swim parallel. Panic is an old friend in a new hat." It tried to climb onto my back and ride me under. I let it sit for a beat, then shrugged it off and did what she said. Long strokes sideways, breath when the water allowed, quiet when it didn't. Beside me, Bate moved with the grace of someone who understands that resistance, misapplied, is surrender. We slid across the pole until the ocean lost interest. Then we angled in. On the sand, lungs doing their drum solo, we lay on towels and watched gulls boss each other into worse decisions. "You did good," she said, touching my wrist as if to confirm I was still arranged correctly. "You listened." "I wanted to be brave," I said. "Turns out I needed to be obedient." She laughed, the kind of laugh that lets sun in. "That's most of it." Later, in the shade of a faded umbrella, I told her about the beach house again, this time as a story that no longer required me to audition for its pain. She said we weren't serious, I said, that it was just fun. I watched the light play on Bates' face in broken coins. I think that's when I learned what I want, seriousness that wears joy like a casual shirt. Bate chewed on a grape like it held a thesis. "Serious," she said, "as in attentive, as in accountable, as in not subject to market forces." She grinned. "I can do that." We built a year like a reef, structure first, color later, fights that ended before midnight. Apologies drafted without legalese. Weekends with no plans that turned into the best plans. I started volunteering at the lab, labeling vials with handwriting that improved, learning to love the smell of ethanol and salt because it meant I was helping a living thing stabilize. Her team called me the spreadsheet whisperer. I called myself lucky and meant it in the old, unfashionable way that recognizes work inside grace. One afternoon, as we monitored a tank, Bate looked up and said, "It would be nice to have you in the water more often without the rental fees." I blinked at her. She rolled her eyes at my slowness and held up a key on a blue float. "Want to move in?" The yes came from that quiet place inside me that had learned how to unclench. We packed my apartment in 2 weekends of dust and discovery. I found the notebook with the 2 lists and read them again just to honor the man who had written them the night the comments turned, the man who had chosen to be alone rather than a prop. I tucked the notebook into a box labeled Keep. The day we moved, the sky toyed with fog, then decided on clear. As we unloaded into a place near the water where succulents thrived without applause, my phone lit up with a number I had once memorized. I let it ring, then let it go to silence. Later, a text, "Have a good life." It wasn't cruel, it was rare, a boundary blessed by the one who once broke it. I typed, "You too." It was the truest thing left to say. Resolution. A year later to the day, we stood at the same stretch of shore where the rip current had suggested humility. Bate wore a gray hoodie that made her look like the first honest sky. I carried a ring in my pocket that made my palms sweat, a small loud circle waiting its turn to speak. The waves counted time without caring about human ceremonies. "I used to think love was a good photo," I said, my voice doing that soft shake that tells you the heart is awake. "Then I thought it was an invoice, proof something of value had been exchanged. Now I think it's this. Choosing the same person on ordinary days when no one is watching and the water doesn't clap." She looked at me like breath had taught her a new trick and nodded once, a precise acceptance of weather. I knelt because some gestures still matter, because ritual builds memory's muscle. "Bate," I said, saying her name like a clean room, "be serious with me forever." She laughed and started crying in the same breath, which is what honesty sounds like when it forgets to be composed. "Yes," she said, "and yes, and yes." I slid the ring onto her hand. It looked like something we could afford and exactly what we wanted. Simple, strong, uninterested in applause. We didn't post about it. We told the people who hold our history, then ate tacos that dripped down our wrists and made out like teenagers in the parking lot because dignity has to share space with joy or it calcifies. At home, I taped my 2 lists inside a kitchen cabinet. On rough days, we read them aloud. On good days, we cooked without opening the door. Most days, we forgot they were there because we were too busy living inside their yes. Epilogue hook. Sometimes, when the tide is very low, the beach coughs up old things, bottle caps, shells, a bracelet that once belonged to a girl who believed in forever for one summer. I've never found the key from that rented house. I hope she kept it as a lesson or threw it into the sea and let the salt eat the last of its shine. Either way, the door it opened now stands behind me, and the one I chose opens every morning onto a kitchen where the light arrives without a caption.